Welcome to MileHiCon and the Sunday 1 p.m. panel entitled Lone Wolves and Other Renegades. My name is Lou J. Berger, and I'm a Denver-based author. Today, I'll be reading excerpts from two stories of mine. One was just released on Thursday. It's a novelette set in Quincy J. Allen's Blood War Chronicles universe, an origin story of one Skeeter, who appears for the first time in Quincy's first book, Blood Ties. She's a tinkerer and an orphan. And if you're wondering how these two things came to be true, I shall begin immediately with The Company You Keep by Lou J. Berger, edited by Quincy J. Allen. And so we begin. December 1864. Skeeter huddled on the concrete steps outside the restaurant's alley-facing back door, peeling a potato with a dull knife. Flecks of half-frozen Chicago rain, stinking of factory smoke, slaughterhouse rot, and coal, spattered against her skin, making her shiver. She didn't mind. The dirty alley was a welcome change from the chaos behind her. Inside the kitchen, Hilda, the restaurant owner's wife, screamed at the dishwasher and the cook, slamming pots and pans about, complaining of one's laziness and the other's slow habits. The restaurant served mostly the local working-class people who lived in the neighborhood, offering them decent food for fair prices. Basic staples like freshly baked bread, pork cutlets, beaten flat and breaded, and boiled sauerkraut were popular dishes. The owner, Gunter, liked to watch the diners from behind the dining room counter, a sour expression on his face, hoping to catch somebody stealing the silverware. He always had a meat cleaver nearby as a deterrent. Skeeter wiped the sleeve of her rough spun dress across her nose, eyeing with disgust the thick yellow mucus that streaked it. Her head pounded, and she felt a little dizzy, but the cold, wet air felt good on her fevered forehead. She finished peeling a potato and reached for another. She detested peeling potatoes. The knife was never sharp enough, the repetitive motions hurt her wrist, and it was the same boring process with each and every new potato. Her mind drifted as she peeled, imagining a small steam engine, gears whirring precisely, and a pressure-sensitive, self-sharpening blade that could be adjusted to skim just beneath the surface of the potato skin, turning a regular potato into a peeled one in mere seconds with little waste. While her hands wielded the knife with quick, efficient movements, creating long, continuous strips of peel that fell away from the tuber, she constructed the machine in her mind. First, an adjustable claw that would dip into a bucket of dirty water and retrieve a potato. Next, an alignment mechanism that would rotate the captured potato, then drive a brass pin through its long axis of rotation. A step-down gear, conical, so that it could have an infinitely adjustable torque, would then spin the potato rapidly. Next, a pulley system that would press the whirling tuber against a circular disc of high-carbon steel, slicing away only the skin, leaving the white flesh of the potato unmarked beneath. A bucket to capture the peels, and a grindstone powered by shining brass gears, driven by the small portable steam engine, and the entire thing glowed in her mind's eye, an engineering marvel designed for a specific, useful purpose. Once she had put the imaginary machine through a series of tests to make sure it would work, her focus returned to the job at hand. Now that she knew an innovative solution was available, she didn't hate peeling potatoes as much. She did, however, still despise Hilda's raucous, grating voice. Skeeter's father was upstairs with a broken leg. They lived above the restaurant in a tiny apartment. He had slipped in the mud at just the wrong time, in exactly the wrong place, and a draft horse had pulled a wagon full of whiskey barrels over him. The sound of her father's thigh bone breaking still echoed in her ears like a gunshot, and now a sweet stink surrounded him like a cloying fog. It was the kind of stench that gave her a good reason to want to earn a nickel, peeling potatoes on the steps in the alley, instead of staying indoors and reading yet another borrowed book. A man's hoarse, pained scream came from above, and Skeeter stopped peeling, trying to determine its location. Was that her father? Skeeter's mother's voice was next, begging somebody to leave him alone. An angry shout floated down from an upper window 2 stories above the restaurant. It was Gunter. He wasn't in the restaurant anymore. A cold dread clenched Skeeter's belly. Skeeter dropped the knife and the half-peeled potato into the bucket of water and ran through the kitchen to the stairway as fast as her 8-year-old legs could take her. She sprinted up to the third-floor landing, ignoring Hilda's screech behind her, taking the stairs two at a time, a cold fear clutching at her gut. She knew that Gunther didn't like immigrants in general, and Irish ones in particular. What if they were being evicted again? At the top of the third-floor landing, she saw Gunther's massive bulk filling the narrow doorway of their apartment. "What good are you, you lazy, stinking Mick?" shouted Gunther. "I trusted you to give me a fair day's wage in exchange for living in this luxury apartment. You've sat on your ass for 3 days now." Her mother's voice raged from within. "He's badly hurt. I begged you to send a doctor. Now his leg's turned." Gunther shouted. "Keep your mouth shut, or make up for your husband's indolence by opening it a little wider for me. Do you hear?" Her mother shrieked in rage. Suddenly, Gunther stumbled back into the hallway. The back of his neck and bald head turned crimson. Then he slowly lifted the cleaver high and stepped into their apartment. Red splotches of blood spattered the ceiling and the lintel of the doorway. Every time he lifted the blade, it grew more coated in blood. Skeeter's mother screamed every time the blade came down. Finally, Gunther stepped back, dropping his hand by his side, the cleaver draining a thin rivulet of blood onto the grimy floorboards of the tenement hall. "Let that be a lesson to you," he raged. "Now I don't have to wait for him to heal up, do I? I knew I shouldn't have let you wretches in here. Now clean up this mess, whore. When you're finished, come downstairs to beg me to let you keep living under my roof." The sound of her mother's weeping filled Skeeter's ears. She stood, numbly. Gunther turned to go, but stopped when he saw Skeeter standing at the top of the stairway. She shrank from him, her eyes wide, her pounding heart making the fabric of her dress flutter. Gunther saw her and smiled, his eyes lit with desire, and Skeeter took a step to the side, not wanting to block his movement downstairs. A dark shadow moved behind him, from the direction of the doorway to the apartment. A howling shriek filled the air. Skeeter's mother jumped on Gunther's back. Her face was a mask of rage and despair, inhuman and terrifying. She bit his ear, her teeth sinking deep into it. He bellowed and spun like a frightened bull, dropping the cleaver and sending her crashing against a wall and down onto the floor. The cleaver clattered against the floorboards. Gunther clapped his hand against his ear, then brought it forward to look at it. Blood slid down his neck in a thick stream, staining his shirt. Skeeter's mother spat a chunk of ear to the floor and then scrambled to her feet, one hand cradling her swollen belly. She backed into the doorway and braced herself with one arm behind her. "Murderer! My husband was a decent, godly man and a good provider. You have no right." Gunther stared at her in disbelief, then took a step toward her, then another. He swung back a fat leg and delivered a crushing kick right into the center of her belly, propelling her through the doorway. She crashed into the wall, sending dishware and pots and pans clattering for a moment. Then an eerie silence filled the hallway, the only sound being the raspy wheeze of the restaurant owner. He clapped his hand to his ear again, and red blood oozed between his fingers. He stared into the apartment for a long moment, trying to catch his breath. Finally, after a long minute of gasping, he turned to Skeeter, a ferocious scowl in his face. "Your parents cost me a great deal of money, you parasite," he said, as he bent down, picked up the bloody cleaver, and stopped in front of her. He looked at her like a butcher would eye a healthy cut of meat. "And you will repay me, one way or another." He clumped down the stairs, the sound of his footfalls following him down to a lower level, then the crash of a door, and a bellowed shout of rage that faded away into silence yet again. Skeeter crept across the stair landing and into the hallway, then closer to the doorway. A bright coppery smell filled the air, and the silence inside the apartment was the loudest sound Skeeter had ever heard. She stepped through the doorway. Her mother was sitting on the floor, clutching her belly. A thick pool of blood grew beneath her. Just beyond her was her husband's body. Deep cleaver cuts had been slashed across his forearms and neck. His eyes were open, but unseeing. Blood covered the walls and pooled on the floor. Skeeter's father's body was still and unmoving. His chest did not rise with breath. Skeeter sat next to her mother, clutching her hand, watching her mother grow ever more pale as the seconds went by. "Dear God," her mother whispered, her lips turning blue. I can't feel the baby kicking. He's not moving at all. A surge of hope filled Skeeter's chest. Maybe the baby would be okay. Really, Mama? Do you think it will be a boy? Her mother turned to her, eyes filled with tears. I did, she whispered. Her face was so pale, so white. Tears slid down Skeeter's cheeks. Can we name him Michael? Her mother lifted a hand and caressed Skeeter's cheek with a cold, sticky hand. That's a lovely name, she said. She closed her eyes and snored. Skeeter laughed. Then her mother's head lolled backward, her eyes still open, her mouth falling agape. She snored once more, then let out a long, gentle sigh. And then in that moment, Skeeter saw her mother turn from a person, warm and vibrant and alive, into a corpse. The sun went down eventually, but Skeeter couldn't let go of her mother's hand. In the silence, she lost track of time and space, drifting in a haze, then snapping out of it, finding her mother's hand still in hers and squeezing it, wanting to tell her mother of the horrid dream she had had and how there was blood everywhere. The smell of sheared metal still filled the room. When Skeeter eventually gathered the strength to stand, she was temporarily stuck to the floor by the congealed blood that had soaked her dress and dried. It was thick, sticky, and cold. She pulled off her dress and threw it into a corner. Stepping past her father, she closed the door, locking it securely. Then she lit a lantern and washed off as best as she could with cold water. Finally, she climbed into the bed they had all shared. The night was long, and Skeeter endured nightmare after nightmare, waking ever so often with a grim determination that in the morning she'd have to clean up the bodies as best she could. The next morning, as gray light came through the grimy window, Skeeter set water on the stove to boil. After arranging all her parents' clothes on the floor, she cut them into long strips and made rags from them. Using the hot water and the rags, she cleaned up the floor, the walls, and the furniture, removing the sticky, congealed blood one pool at a time. When she was finished, her arms were reddened and tired. Her parents lay, side by side, arranged peacefully as if they were merely sleeping. She bathed and made herself as presentable as possible, then went downstairs. Hilda scowled at her for being late, but grew quiet when Skeeter asked her if she had any old sheets or bedspreads that were no good and could be thrown away. She followed Skeeter upstairs with arms full of moth-eaten sheets and bedspreads and gasped when she saw the bodies. Silently, Hilda helped her wrap Skeeter's parents, first in the sheets, then in the bedspreads, tying the bundles up with coarse twine. Together, they dragged the bodies out into the hallway. Hilda ordered the dishwasher and one of the cooks to carry them downstairs, where a horse-drawn wagon awaited them in the alley, which Hilda had arranged for. Once her parents were loaded onto the wagon, Skeeter stroked the soft, velvety muzzle of the roan horse that pulled the wagon. The wagon driver was a burly man with massive forearms and kind eyes, smoking a short, foul-smelling cigar. Hilda had called him a fixer, saying that he made certain problems go away. What is your name? Skeeter asked him shyly. The fixer held the reins loosely in his calloused hands and looked down at her from his perch. Jollity filled his eyes, but when he saw the wan expression on Skeeter's face, he grew serious. Quincy, he said. With a tilt of his head, he indicated the wrapped bodies behind him in the bed of the wagon. These folks important to you? Skeeter climbed up the spoked wheel and stood on the buckboard next to Quincy. She stared at the wrapped bodies, so still in their floral shrouds. They were all I ever had. Quincy gave her a long look. Don't worry your pretty head about them. I'll make sure they find a place to rest where nobody will ever bother them again. Skeeter looked into his eyes. Something made her want to trust him. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a pair of worn copper coins taken from her mother's purse. She needed the coins if she wasn't going to starve, but her parents were worth going hungry. It's not much, she said. Quincy shook his head. I can't take your money. Hilda paid me already. Keep it. He then tipped his hat and held out a brawny hand for her to hold as she stepped off the wagon. Once she stood on the alley's grimed concrete, he shifted the stub of his cigar from one side of his mouth to the other and flicked the reins. Yah! He shouted at the horse, which began to plod out of the alleyway. Skeeter watched the wagon until it had turned the corner, then stared at the place where it had disappeared. wishing against reason that her parents, arm in arm, might walk back around that same corner, smiling and laughing, calling out to her that the entire thing had been a joke. But they didn't. When she turned away, her eyes were dry and her shoulders were square. She marched into the kitchen and grabbed a knife and a bag of potatoes. Hilda, wide-eyed in astonishment that the little girl whose parents her husband had murdered would still be doing her chores, demanded, "Just what do you think you are doing?" "Gunther said I had to repay our debts," Skeeter replied, her eyes staring into Hilda's. Hilda nodded, then shooed her back up to the outside step. "Don't leave so much skin on the potatoes this time." Skeeter buried herself in the task of peeling potatoes, imagining how the knife, sliding through the peel, might feel against Gunther's throat. And that's where I'll stop this little excerpt. If you want to find out what happens next, you'll have to plunk down a penny less than $3 to get the rest of the story. Okay, now on to the next one. Next, I'll read some of the beginning of another book of mine, in homage to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Professor George Edward Challenger, the burly, brusque protagonist from his novel, The Lost World. This story takes place about 6 months after the adventures described in The Lost World, and I highly recommend that you read that novel first before you finish this story of mine. It begins with our intrepid narrator, Edward Malone, working at his desk as a reporter for the Daily Gazette of London. This is The Serpent of the Loch. The unmistakable sound of shattering glass interrupted my composition of an article about a dead white tiger at the London Zoo. I raised the nib of my pen and looked around the newsroom, noticing that the other reporters were also startled. They all gazed towards the waiting room, some shocked, some merely curious. The incomparable McArdle, my round-backed, crabbed editor, burst from his office with a worried expression on his old Scottish face. He turned to me and said, "What's happened to create such a furious din?" I didn't know because my mind was still focused on the recent memory of a once majestic Bengal tiger lying glassy-eyed and motionless in his cage. Another sound, this one of splintering wood, emanated from the waiting room and was immediately followed by an angry shout. A cold hand clutched the fibers of my entrails as I recognized the perpetrator of that shout. I'd heard it before, aimed at me in rage. McArdle afforded the briefest of glances at my visage, and it was a clear demonstration of his remarkable wit and intuition that he immediately widened his eyes, ran a nervous hand through his hair, and blurted out the words I was afraid to say aloud. "It's that divil, Professor Challenger, isn't it?" My nod was unnecessary because at that precise moment, the professor himself, hair in disarray, burst into the newsroom with 2 copyboys hanging like remoras from his massive arms. He stood 6 feet tall, but that was not the full measure of the man. He was also at least 4 feet wide through the middle, with trunk-like legs and a waistcoat stretched to bursting by the contours of his mighty chest. His black beard jutted from his chin and cascaded down his front, curling from an enormous florid face. Unruly black hair lay plastered in a long wisp across his broad forehead. Dark eyes, close set and critical, peered out from beneath great black eyebrows. He appeared to be the human equivalent of an Assyrian bull. "There you are," he shouted, once his intense gaze had swept the room and found me. "Kindly remove your minions from my corpus and instruct them to demonstrate the deference I have earned, for I am, as I stated downstairs, Professor George Edward Challenger." He directed this last bit to the boy hanging from his left arm, and I'm not sure if it was the force of the words themselves that caused the boy to let go, or the mass of spittle that leapt from Challenger's mouth. Whatever the reason, the copyboy dropped to the floor with a loud thump. Quickly, Challenger reached around and grabbed the other copyboy, and with no discernible exertion, hurled him through the air like a dandelion seed, easily clearing 3 desks. Challenger straightened his waistcoat with giant hair-covered hands and stalked in my direction, coming to a halt in front of me. He was attired smartly in a suit, complete with riding boots that gleamed like dark mirrors. He put his massive hands on my shoulders and squeezed. I winced, anticipating a bit of trouble falling asleep later that night due to bruising. "How are you, my boy?" he thundered. "It's been some time since our last adventure, and I must admit that I've been thinking of you lately. You have? I stammered. Why, Professor, I'm honored. I too enjoyed South America and have found my mind casting back again and again to the terrors and triumphs of that excursion. Challenger beamed at me and smiled with full red lips. Marvelous, he shouted, causing McCardle, who had approached in cautious silence, to take a frantic step back. I discreetly waved him aside. I have a proposition for you, and as you know, I have a particular aversion to your sneaky colleagues. He glowered at the goggle-eyed reporters scattered around the room, and they scurried back to their desks, pretending to be busy while still casting furtive glances in his direction. Challenger glared at them for a heartbeat more before turning his attention back to me. He lowered his voice. But now is neither the time nor the place to discuss this proposition. Come to my home at 7 tonight. Bring a satchel with several changes of clothing. I intend for us to take a short journey. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small white card, which he placed into my hand. We'll talk more about it then. He whirled around and stomped back to the stairwell and paused before turning to face the newsroom. Don't think for a second I haven't memorized each and every face on this floor, he shouted, his beard quivering in irritation. If even a single scurrilous one of you cockroaches dares write a word of my unavoidable descent into this den of liars, I will have you clapped in irons and brought before the magistrate. His voice echoed throughout the newsroom, and a grave silence fell upon the other reporters, most of whom grew pallid and reached for their chairs with trembling fingers. He grunted, appearing to be pleased with himself. He looked back in my direction, gave me a solemn wink from one blue-gray eye, and disappeared down the stairwell. A collective sigh of relief went up, and my desk was instantly surrounded by my brethren. They peppered me with questions as to the professor's demeanor. What did he mean about a proposition and similar inquiries? The previously hurled copyboy rose to his feet, shook his head as if to clear it, and then limped downstairs, assisted by his battered colleague. I parried their inquiries and gathered my belongings before ducking into McArdle's office, editor sans reproche, and shut the door behind me, affording us some much-needed silence. I hereby request, McCardle waved away my words as if they were mere spiderwebs. Spare me, my lad. I ken that you're caught in the clutches of an unstoppable force of nature. Go on with you and write about whatever the professor drags you into. I closed my mouth and nodded, already wondering what Challenger had in mind. Right then. I shall head on over. Thanks. By the way, can you get somebody to handle the tiger piece? I have it almost finished on my desk. For God's sake, Malone, said McArdle, his voice gruff. Don't keep that divil waiting. He's likely as not to have my head on a servant platter if I keep you for another moment. Go and finish the article on your own time. He made a dismissive gesture and then bent over his desk, grabbed a document, and peered at it through his bifocals. I picked up a new journal and a fresh bottle of ink. After a moment's thought, I borrowed a small black case from the photographer, then hurried from the newsroom. I rang the doorbell at precisely 5 minutes to 7, and the door swung open, revealing the lovely Mrs. Challenger, who squealed in delight, throwing her arms around me. Edward, she cried, her eyes dancing, how lovely to see you again. Would you like some tea? Her hands flitted about her apron like little butterflies, and I felt a slow flush creep up from my collar. After I'd helped save Challenger's life in Brazil, she had developed a fondness for me. She reached forward and took my traveling bag from my nerveless fingers and placed it in an alcove. No, thank you, Mrs. Challenger. The professor asked me to stop by and discuss a proposition with him, but I have no idea what it's about. Might you shed some light on this mystery? She gazed at me, and for a moment, I found myself mesmerized by her intense focus. She shook her head slowly and bit her lower lip. No, in this case, I cannot assist you. Do you think you might be going back to Brazil? She asked, her brow furrowed with worry. Those ape men he spoke about, She shuddered in revulsion. Oh, I hope you don't. I don't think so. He's probably done all he needed to do there. She smiled. Well then, let's not keep him waiting now. She led me along the hallway, past the kitchen, and towards the study. I paused in front of a marble column that, last time I'd visited, had served as a temporary perch for her diminutive form. I hid a small smile, cherishing the memory, as she opened the study door and peeked inside. George, are you available for a visitor? Edward Malone is here to see you. Send him in, boomed his familiar voice, and fetch us, dear woman, some of those finger sandwiches from the luncheon today. Do we have any left? She waved me in and left to get us some snacks. It was just as I had remembered from my previous visit. A pall of blue smoke hung in the air, accompanied by the strong odor of burning tobacco. I squinted and coughed, for the acrid fumes stung my eyes. The professor noticed my discomfort and leapt up to throw open a window, waving his hands around to push the smoke outside. Oh, I'm sorry. My previous visitor is a pipe smoker and has an inordinate fondness for shag-cut tobacco. I gaped at him, finding his sudden servility to be out of character. What manner of visitor might have had such an effect on the professor? He stopped and stared in dismay at a Turkish slipper filled with tobacco lying on a mahogany side table. Bother, he muttered. Mrs. Challenger returned with a silver tray of finger sandwiches, a pot of tea, and some biscuits. Professor Challenger watched her set the tray down, then handed her the slipper. Please see that he gets this back, he murmured, and thank him for taking the time to consult with me. She took the slipper, smiled at me, then moved into the hallway, closing the door behind her. Challenger grabbed a small sandwich and stuffed it whole into his mouth, then moved behind the desk and pulled a key from his waistcoat pocket. He unlocked a drawer and withdrew a worn leather satchel, which he upended, dumping its contents on the desk. There was a photograph, a series of documents, and a gray leathery bit of what looked like dried jerky. He picked up the photograph, squinted at it, and then handed it to me. I examined it with care. It appeared to have been taken from the shoreline, looking out over a lake. A rocky tower was visible on the far side of the water, and the lighting suggested either dawn or dusk. A snake-like dark outline rose from the still, flat water, trailing a slight wake behind it. It looked like a water serpent. Looks a bit like the neck and head of that plesiosaur we saw in South America. I handed the photograph back. He stowed it back in the satchel, grunted in approval, and handed me the dried leathery bit. This was found floating on the surface after Spicer fired at the thing. He said he saw and heard the round strike home, a spray of blood erupted, and a chunk of flesh flew from the back of the creature. He waded in as far as he dared in order to retrieve it, but the loch is very deep in that area. He admits to being forced to swim. So it's a loch, you say? I arched an inquisitive eyebrow. Up in Scotland? Challenger scowled. Where else would a lake be called a loch? Don't ask stupid questions. Chastened, I bent to examine the leathery bit he'd handed me. It appeared desiccated and scaly, as a fish might. The skin was not smooth as an amphibian's. I brought it to my nose and took a careful whiff. It smelled a bit gamey, with a distinct but unfamiliar odor. I threw it back on his desk. So, it's a chunk of fish? Challenger scowled and threw up his hands. No! Are you blind? He shouted. The dentition of the scales is not placoid in the least bit, and there are no central ridges on fish scales. He grabbed a magnifying glass and thrust both it and the specimen at me. Look again, Malone. I peered through the glass at the scales, and they leapt towards me in great magnification. I frowned, trying to understand what I was looking at, and the professor adopted a more gentle tone. See the epidermal component of these scales, the central ridge. The morphology of this creature is definitely reptilian. We know that the lochs of Scotland are freshwater now, but they were once saltwater. It's entirely possible that this creature is a freshwater adapted descendant of a seagoing plesiosaur. Okay, I believe you. Who the devil is this Spicer fellow? I handed him back both the magnifying glass and the specimen. Challenger sat in his chair and interlocked his fingers across his wide waistcoat. George Spicer is a charlatan and a con artist who is constantly trying to turn a profit. He lives near Loch Ness. I've come to know him quite well, and I'm not sure that I trust anything he says. He tells me that there has been a cryptid living in the loch for some time now, but he's managed to keep its existence a secret. I took a deep breath. What's a cryptid? I asked, regretting the question as soon as the words left my lips. Challenger scowled and thrust his bristly beard in my direction. My word, it's like talking to a child. A cryptid, you uneducated lout, is a plant or animal that is often well described, but is not considered by scientific authority to actually exist. He smiled, reminiscing, and continued. Like those imbeciles who called our little adventure down in South America a waste of time. They certainly got an eyeful when I opened that crate. With vivid clarity, I recalled the look of triumph on Challenger's face when he had released the live pterodactyl we'd brought back from Brazil. What about this creature that Spicer shot? Challenger sat up and pointed a sausage-wide finger at me. What I intend to do is go up to Loch Ness, capture the beast, and bring it home. And here, time dictates that I stop. If you want to know what happens next, the entire story is available on Amazon as well. Thank you for listening to my reading, and I hope you enjoyed the beginnings, at least, of my 2 stories. Thanks for attending MileHiCon, and as always, you can reach me on Twitter at LouJBerger, or you can write me directly at lou@loujberger.com. I hope you enjoy the rest of your virtual MileHiCon.